In this presentation, you'll learn what type of statements need to be supported by proof, what kind of proof to use, whether quotations or summarized details, and how to incorporate quotations into your writing. You should always provide proof for claims and interpretations. You may ask, well, what is a claim and an interpretation? Is it plausible that someone would disagree with the statement you're making? If so, then you've made a claim. Are you making a statement about an author or character's mindset? If so, you're making a claim or expressing an interpretation. In such cases, you need to provide proof. Press pause and read these two excerpts from a student essay on the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. As you can see in the first one, the student merely quotes a part of the novel that doesn't need to be quoted because it is merely a statement of fact that it is supporting. So the fact is that Huck and Jim escaped together. That's an indisputable fact from the story. It doesn't need any proof, yet the student has provided a quotation that really just repeats the fact she stated. So that's an example of what not to do. And the second, by contrast, the student has to prove Huck's mindset. She has to prove that Huck rejects the manners and morals of the society in which he lives. And that proof has not been presented in this paragraph, but I'm just giving you the example of the type of statement that needs to be proven. Press pause here and compare these two excerpts from a student paper about the nonfiction piece, The Spoils of Happiness. Again, as you can see in the first one, the student has made a statement about what David Sosa does in his article. He's comparing Robert Nozick's experiment to The Matrix. And she quotes that part of the reading. She's being redundant there. There's no need to quote something that is an obvious fact from the reading. Let's compare that to the second version, in which the student is expressing the point of the article, and she would need several pieces of evidence to prove that this is the point of the article. So what the statement she's made there is a claim that needs proof. Once you've decided that you need proof, then you have to decide whether you should quote from the reading or present summarized details from the reading. There are only certain circumstances where you should decide to use a quotation, and that is, are the words vivid and powerful? Usually that means that they're metaphors, they're images, they're words that convey emotion. If the words are vivid, it's a good idea to quote them. And the other circumstance in which you'd use a quote is when the words themselves prove the point. Press pause and read this excerpt from Megan McArdle's article, Is College a Lousy Investment? Which part of the passage do you think you should quote? Press pause and read this student rewrite. As you can see, the student has summarized all the basic facts from that paragraph. The only part the student has quoted is the part that says the federal government has started dropping money out of airplanes. The reason the student quoted that is the most vivid part of the previous excerpt. It's the part in which the writer is using a metaphor for the government freely giving away money, and she's comparing that to them dropping money out of airplanes. So the creativity of that statement is preserved, and the rest, which is just information, is summarized. Again, pause this slide and read this excerpt from that same article by Megan McArdle. Read this student rewrite of that article. You can see how little of the article, of that paragraph, the student has quoted. She's just quoted 4 words from that entire paragraph. And that's because the rest of the paragraph merely communicates information that can be summarized and should be summarized. The part that the student has quoted is the part that preserves Richard Vedder's voice and his emotional reaction. And so she's kept that part. And it's perfectly acceptable to use such partial quotations. In fact, I encourage it because it helps you to cut down on quoting.
Another circumstance in which you would quote is when the words themselves prove the point. So this is relevant when you're making a point about communication, about how something is said or how something is written. So you can see that that's a circumstance that won't happen all that often, but it does happen. Let's look at this example. Pause the slide and read the claim and support. As you can see, the part that is quoted is Alan Greenspan's testimony. And the reason that is quoted, even though those words are not vivid, in fact, they're the opposite of vivid. They're obscure, they're wordy, but the reason they're quoted is because they themselves prove the point of the claim. The claim is that government bureaucrats communicate obscurely, and that quote is a perfect illustration of that claim. So it's showing the reader this rather than telling them, and it communicates the point much more clearly than if the student had tried to somehow summarize that information. It is the proof. So another circumstance in which you would use that is, let's say you are critiquing a piece of literature, or, maybe let's say a poem, for instance, and you want to bring out how the poet um, writes very vividly, or you want to bring out something positive. Well, in that case, of course, you would have to quote to prove that it is the evidence. So, in that somewhat rare circumstance in which you are making a point, your claim is about communication itself, you would have to quote to prove the point.
Sometimes you might find that you want to use a quote, but you don't need the entire quotation. You just need part of it. One way to deal with that and cut out the parts you don't need is to use ellipsis marks. You've probably seen these often when you're reading. It's the 3 little dots that indicate to readers that the writer is leaving something out of the quotation. So pause the slide and read the excerpt from the student essay as well as the revision. You can see in the revised version that the student has kept the 2 parts of the quotation that prove the point she wants to make, the first and the last part. She's left out the middle part. Just be careful when you do this, when you use ellipsis marks, that even though you're leaving out content, that the rest of what you have is grammatical. In this case, the revised version, it is, because the student has used 2 full sentences, one from the beginning of the quote, one from the end of the quote, so it's still grammatical. Well, what if you did not include a quotation and you want to summarize facts from the article? How do you do that? One of the challenges is summarizing statistics. How do you summarize statistics? Oftentimes I will see students quoting large you know, paragraphs of statistics when indeed that information should have been summarized. Let's just look at one example. In the top there, that's from Marty Nemco's America's Most Overrated Product. He quotes the statistic that 27% of all undergraduate students binge drink regularly. Now, if you wanted to include that statistic in your paper, how would you do that without quoting it? Well, just kind of think about what the statistic is communicating. 27%, that's a little over a quarter. So you could phrase it that way. You can say, NIMCO cites a 2000 study indicating that binge drinking is a standard practice for more than a quarter of undergraduates. Or how else might you indicate that figure? Well, you could say more than 1 in 4. You could say that way. Approximately 1 in 4 undergraduates habitually binge drink. So just think about the statistic and how you might rephrase it. And if you don't need the exact number, if it's not important to get the exact number, then you could probably rephrase it as an approximation.
In all cases, whether you summarize or quote, always use the full name of the source when you first mention the source and briefly indicate the relevant credentials of that source. If you do not indicate the relevant credentials of a source when you first mention it, readers will have no reason to trust the information that you're presenting from that source. Mentioning the credentials of the source establishes that source's authority on that topic.
At this point, let's talk about how to incorporate quotations within your paper. Let's say you decide you need a quotation. Well, how do you put it in your paper? We're going to discuss three correct ways to put the quotations in your paper. Pause this slide and look at these four excerpts. They're the same in content pretty much, but I want you to see if you can tell the difference in how the quotations are included in each one. Can you see the difference? The first one, the student's full sentence is followed by a colon, then the quote. In the second one, the student's full sentence is on its own. There's a period at the end, and then the quote is on its own sentence. The third one, the student has blended the quotation into his or her sentence. And in the fourth one, the student has used a signal phrase, Edmondson asserts, and then presented the quotation. Number 1, number 3, and number 4 are correct. Number 2 is incorrect, and we're going to discuss that on the following slides. The first method that is correct is using your own full sentence and then putting a colon, the two dots, one over the other, and then putting the quote that proves the statement that you just made. So your own full sentence, colon, quotation. That's acceptable. Another acceptable way to include a quotation is to use a signal phrase and a comma and then the quote. So here we see Edmondson asserts, comma, and then the quotation about what Edmondson is asserting. That's also acceptable. Another way to include quotations is to blend the quotation grammatically into your own sentence. Oftentimes students will do this when they're using just a part of the quotation. And we see an example of this here. The student here has used the full quote, but you could also use this to use partial quotes and blend them into your sentence. This is a very sophisticated way of including quotations, and it helps to cut down on the length of quotations because you are mainly expressing the quote in your own words, and you're just including the parts of the rest of the quote, the vivid parts perhaps. You're blending those into your sentence. So this is a really nice way to quote. Should be avoided. It's called the dropped quotation. And it's when you have your own full sentence on its own and then you put a quotation on its own. A quotation should not be in its own sentence. It has to be introduced or blended in some way, as the other three slides have mentioned. This is an unacceptable method, so you want to avoid it. What if you have a rare circumstance where you have to quote a larger passage of 4 lines or more? In MLA style, you would handle that by starting a new, almost like you're starting a new paragraph. You're not really, it's the same paragraph, but you're going on a different line and you're indenting the whole quotation 5 spaces and you're single spacing it. And you can see how this looks physically on the page here right in front of you. In that case, you would not need quotation marks. Normally, in every other case, you would need quotation marks. But if you have a quotation of 4 lines or more, you do not need the quotation marks.
So let's sum up this presentation. You need to prove claims and interpretations. That proof can either be summarized details or quotations. You use quotations when the words are vivid and summarizing would make them lose their power. or when the words themselves prove the point. For basic facts and statistics, summarize rather than quote. Keep quotations brief by blending them into your own sentences, using ellipsis marks when applicable, etc. When first mentioning a source, indicate that source's full name and the relevant credentials. And finally, incorporate quotations correctly. Do not drop them into your writing.